He hōnerei he kororia ki te atua, he maunga rongo ki te whenua, he wakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Ia nā maunga, ia nā waka o te motu nei, nā mihi nui a kia koutou. Ko Waiau, ko J. Ruka tōku ingoa, he uri no taranaki maunga, no reira ko Tiati Awa tōku iwi. It is my privilege to come and share with you guys today through this online forum at the 2020 Justice Conference. And what a phenomenal year to be holding this conference and doing it online. I'm just reminded of this passage in Isaiah chapter 11. And I think this is pertinent for 2020. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears. But with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. I think that's an appropriate scripture to start off. To talk about righteousness and justice. And to talk about justice in our country and justice in a climate that is so wired and hot with angst, with frustration, with systems crumbling. In order to deliver and maintain a lasting presence of social justice, New Zealand must learn and hold our history. There will never be a full sense of justice without a sobering apprehension of our story, the story here in New Zealand. We cannot express justice until we acknowledge the willful disregard of te tiriti or waitangi, breaches brought about by an onslaught of settler economic interest. Learning the scope of treaty mistreatment helps us to poignantly apply an appropriate balm of justice in both a broad and specific ways. Of social justice then confidently calls for a restoration of relationship in light of a historical schism that still gapingly exists. It is nothing new to restate the disproportional welfare and well-being statistics that Māori face. Last year's suicide rates show that Māori once again top the list. If we are serious about preventing the crash at the bottom of the cliff, and offering effective remedies to Māori social issues, then more is required than prescriptions from the outside looking in. Adjusting the statistics begins with a journey to see Māori needs and experiences as Māori have lived them. Therefore, to assist us today in an education process, I want us to explore a timeline of events. Most of these events reveal a narrative of cultural supremacy and oppression that portray arrogant denials of the standards framed within the treaty covenant. By no means is this timeline exhaustive, but by taking an honest look at our history's broken promises, it helps us to understand that we need healing to go much deeper than treaty settlements that just don't cut it. So let's begin in 1835 and Māori independence. In 1835, the United Tribes of Aotearoa, a collection of northern chiefs, signed He Wakaputanga, the New Zealand Declaration of Independence. There is a strong interplay between this document and Te Tiriti, the treaty, both in language but especially in the expectations of Māori. The intent of this document was to declare Māori sovereignty of Aotearoa to the international community. The following year, the British government acknowledged the declaration, formally recognising New Zealand as an independent state. 1837 and humanitarian advocacy. In London, the House of Commons Committee for Aborigines and British Settlements released a report that warned of the effects of uncontrolled British subjects on Indigenous peoples. Advocacy was raised in England with the hope that Māori would not suffer land seizures, war, disease, and other negative effects of an expanding empire. 1839, settling New Zealand. European interest in New Zealand had increased since 1837, as a business venture called the New Zealand Company formed to settle the country. However, as previously mentioned, humanitarian influence fought the New Zealand Company at every level, including within the British government. The missionaries in New Zealand didn't want the company involved in New Zealand either, and on top of this, the French also had their eyes on New Zealand and were making their own plans to settle. To counteract these swirling forces, the British Crown sent Captain Hobson to annex New Zealand by creating a treaty with Māori. Hobson had instructions drafted by Sir James Stephen, a founding member of the Aborigines Protection Society and the nephew of William Wilberforce. It contained the following order: all dealings with the Aborigines for their lands must be conducted on the same principles of sincerity, justice, and good faith. They must not be permitted to enter into any contracts in which they might be the ignorant and unintentional authors of injuries to themselves. The acquisition of land by the Crown for the future settlement of British subjects must be confined to such districts as the natives can alienate without distress or serious inconvenience to themselves. To secure the observance of this will be one of the first duties of their official protector. 1840 and Te Tiriti. The following year, Captain Hobson arrived in New Zealand, and with the help of the missionaries, Te Tiriti or Waitangi was signed by over 500 rangatira. 9 treaty sheets were taken around the country over a 7-month period. Article 1 of Te Tiriti refers to ko ngā rangatira o te waka menenga, the chiefs of the Confederation of the United Tribes of New Zealand. This is an acknowledgement from the Crown of New Zealand's independent statehood, as expressed 5 years earlier in He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence. Article 2 states, the Queen of England confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and tribes of New Zealand the full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands and estates, forests, fisheries and other properties which they may collectively or individually possess. In the English and Māori versions, it is explicitly clear what the Crown is promising Māori under the banner of their own autonomy, their own rangatiratanga. Article 2 also gives the Crown the right of preemption, that all land Māori wish to sell must be sold to the Crown. The colonial office and missionary intent behind this was to halt the New Zealand Company and others from purchasing massive land blocks at an unfair rate, then on-selling at an exorbitant profit. This was a sin the Crown would eventually commit. At the treaty signings, Hobson expected the treaty to initiate a new relationship. His expectation was that Māori and English would share authority and the intervention of Britain would be restrained. At Hokianga, Hobson said, the Queen did not want the land, but merely the sovereignty that she might be able more effectually to govern her subjects, who had already settled. The residing Wesleyan missionary, John Hobbs, stated that Māori land would never be forcibly taken, and that truth and justice would always characterise the proceedings of the Queen's government. No matter what misgivings Māori had of the treaty, they were continually reassured that their mana would remain uncompromised. This promise to retain mana reaffirmed He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence. 1844 and the authority of flags. 4 years after the treaty signing, Hone Heke cut down the flagpole at Kororareka, modern-day Russell. He had originally gifted the pole to fly the United Tribes flag, created in 1834, but the British replaced the United Tribes flag with the Union Jack. Hone Heke did not agree with the flag being replaced, so he cut down the pole. The English put the flagpole back up, and Heke kept cutting it down. The fourth time Heke cut it down led to the first outbreak of war in 1845. 1847 and the New Zealand Supreme Court, and man, this is a good one. In 1847, the first case of the New Zealand Colonial Supreme Court took place. An observation needs to be made here as to how the Supreme Court used the treaty. The Crown had waived its exclusive right to purchase land from Māori in 1844 because 4 years after the treaty was signed, land sales had slowed down. But the new governor, George Grey, revoked this waiver in 1846, reinstating the Crown's preemption. In other words, for 2 years, settlers were allowed to buy land directly from Māori. A settler who bought during this waiver period complained over Grey's decision and took the case to the court. The court found that the settler's purchase during the waiver period was invalid because, according to the treaty, only the Crown is permitted to buy Māori land. In declaring this, the Supreme Court affirmed the Treaty of Waitangi as evidence of Māori ownership of land under what the English called Aboriginal or customary title. It also affirmed the Crown was justified in its claim because this evidence, based in the treaty, made it so. However, instead of this ruling giving the Treaty of Waitangi a home in our legal system and setting a precedent, the Court and Crown from then on rejected the precedent when any claim to the treaty by Māori opposed their colonial purposes. The same court that upheld the treaty for Crown purposes would later declare the treaty worthless and a simple nullity, again for their own purposes. 1852 and Māori can't vote. The domineering figure, George Grey, pushed for the establishment of a New Zealand Parliament under the New Zealand Constitution Act. England obliged, allowing New Zealand to frame their own government. However, to vote you had to be male, over 21 years old, and own the individual title of land. Māori land was owned collectively, without Eurocentric certification. Therefore, Māori were intentionally eliminated from voting. A later MP held the view that the government would face grave inconveniences and probable dangers if the vote was given to a large body of men who are destitute of political knowledge, who are mainly ignorant of the language in which our laws were written, and amongst whom respect for the law cannot as yet be enforced. Needless to say, institutional racism was embedded in the New Zealand government from the outset. 1863 and attacking the rightful owners. George Grey passed the New Zealand Settlements Act, stating that any tribe in rebellion to the government would have their land confiscated. The purpose of this law was to punish the kingitanga and any authority deemed in opposition to the Crown. 1.3 million hectares were taken because Māori were trying to defend their ancestral land, which includes Ehu Mātau. 1864 and public works theft. The injustice continued in the Public Works Act. The new Premier, Frederick World, faced two issues: how to resolve confiscations and how to end the Waikato War. Wanting to assert Crown authority, the Public Works Act justified land theft for the greater good of New Zealand infrastructure. World's hardline position was clear. Those Māori who wanted peace would be treated with moderation. Those who resist will be pacified so the settlement could proceed. While the motivation of the Works Act was in part to appease Crown conscience, ultimately it was an economic act to gain commodities and make the New Zealand settlement self-sufficient. 1865, and making injustice legal. To continue the rampage of stripping Māori from land and to make it look legal, the Native Land Court was established to administer the Native Lands Act that historian Judith Binney regarded as an act of war. The design of the court was to whittle away customary title and to force tribal land into the ownership of just 10 people, thereby economically and environmentally dispossessing most of the tribe. The previous 2 years of Crown-induced warfare had not provided the amount of land the Crown desired. The court was determined to satisfy an insatiable settler appetite for land. Henry Sewell, the Justice Minister at the time, said the purpose of the court was, and I quote, to bring the great bulk of the lands in the Northern Island within the reach of colonisation and the detribalisation of the Māori to destroy, if it was possible, the principle of communism upon which their social system is based and which stands as a barrier in the way of all attempts to amalgamate the Māori into our social and political system. Sila. Think about that for a moment. Coming back to the present, for most New Zealanders, history like this is unknown, even though it is easily accessible on state-funded websites. We are largely oblivious to the fact that the structure that pays for and hosts this historical information, the structure we vote people into every 3 years, is itself the medium, the vehicle of Māori destitution, poverty, and a consistent poor showing of well-being statistics. So if we are honest, and if we want to bring justice to the impoverished situations Māori face, then we need to offer more than settlements, social welfare, and budgeting advice. The very halls of political power need a consistent and sharp telling to about how elitist attitudes and broken promises systematically stripped Māori land ownership from 100% to 4.8%. Now, what does the percentage of land ownership have to do with social justice? Not owning the land shouldn't be an excuse for underachieving in New Zealand society, right? But remember, our colonising economy is a system built on private property ownership, rigged with a Eurocentric bias. Our ideas of property rights are based on the theories of John Locke in the 18th century, in which people gained ownership of natural resources by the cultivation or appropriation of those resources. In other words, gain the resource, gain the wealth. The speed to which the colonial government in New Zealand gained land is equivalent to the speed in which settler wealth increased and Indigenous wealth and well-being plummeted. Our history highlights that Pākehā control of land brought wealth and health to Pākehā, while Māori alienation from land brought devastation and poverty. Māori, far from being partners with the Crown and partnering a functioning economy for all, were militantly ostracised. New Zealand is a showcase highlighting Indigenous degeneration when impoverished settlers from overseas become landowners of Indigenous land. The regal locals were evicted and forced to rent their own mother, forced to rent papatuanuku. Justice is not just unless the beneficiaries of current land ownership and economic privilege understand the historical foundation of their privilege. Let me say that again. Justice is not just unless the beneficiaries of current land ownership and economic privilege understand the historical foundation of their privilege. The elimination of deprivation requires more than a colonial tome to just work harder. Justice is not justice while governmental land and economic management conveniently administrate away a covenantal partnership made between Crown and chiefs in 1840, which was inspired by the gospel of Jesus Christ. What does this all mean for the followers of Christ in New Zealand today? How do we hold this history and deal with it? Well, the gospel, Te Rongopai, the inspiring narrative of Christ embracing the world, is inherently just. Te Rongopai champions justice, and it confronts where justice is lacking. Therefore, first, we must allow the teachings of Christ to critique the community of Christ. The church, in broad terms, must understand its role in historical privilege and then become secure in operating without that privilege. In light of the historical grievance that the church is called to confront, it must first confront itself. Next, for the justice of Te Rongopai to extend beyond the walls of the church, our message must be much closer to home than the pearly gates. The good news shapes the here and now with justice. The inherent truth in Te Rongopai reverberates when it becomes incarnate in our earth. The church at large is a model exemplar of assistance to the immediate desperation in New Zealand society, but the systemic principalities that created Māori poverty, the Crown, and supported by a settler church, must also be confronted. The church can do this by speaking the truth of history and by speaking it in love, by becoming prophetically critical of the colonizer within and without. The prophet Isaiah tells us that God will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. The work of God is to see all things aligned to a state of righteousness and justice, two words with almost identical biblical meaning. Chris Marshall from Victoria University defines justice as that which entails the exercise of legitimate power to ensure that benefits and penalties are distributed fairly and equitably in society, thus meeting the rights and enforcing the obligation of all parties. Considering this definition, matched with our historical narrative, can we say that the power structure of New Zealand is a legitimate power? If our government grasped control by confiscation, legislative theft, and cultural assimilation, all abuses of contractual obligations, then perhaps justice in its truest form calls the Crown's autonomous authority into question. The people of Te Rongopai, the people of the gospel of Christ, must insist the enforcing of historical obligation upon our governing structure. If actual, real, and true justice is to be a reality in our country, the task is a call to the restoration of what our tupuna Māori and our missionary ancestors believed in. It is why Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed by Māori and by missionary. The principal act of injustice in our multicultural country is the bicultural bereavement of a broken covenant. Therefore, to transition from injustice to justice, this process compels every New Zealander to first lose the luxury of ahistorical ignorance. Every New Zealander must be holders of history. Therefore, Christians and church leadership can no longer not know the history of the land anymore, nor the good, the bad, and the ugly of our collective church history. And finally, we must be the prophetic people that calls for righteousness and justice at the core of power politics. Because the core issue is not the moral concerns the church is most vocal over. The core justice issue in our country is the God-given right of Māori to exercise mana on the whenua gifted by God, but taken by man. The core issue is to ratify the partnership, the inherent hope embedded into Te Reti o Waitangi, and those who hope lead. It is my hope that the lens of Indigenous thinking will have its place around every council in New Zealand. And it is my hope that mana Māori will one day permanently share our leadership prowess around the governing table of New Zealand. When this happens, New Zealand will be a creative force of leadership in the world. A wonderful multicultural country embraced within a bicultural partnership, for that's what the treaty promises. These things, I believe, are a commitment to a faithful expression of Te Rongopai, the gospel. They are a dedication to the well-being of our country, to which I compel every New Zealander to speak, to act, and to vote with a spirit of restitution and reconciliation. In doing so, will we actually bring to completion gospel hope and make our history a history of partnership and justice. Nō reira, e nā mana, e nā reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa.